Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the very first series of the 2020 Flex Train brought to you by Johnstone Supply. So what we're going to start out 2020 with, guys, is we're going to start talking about universal parts and the benefits of stocking and utilizing universal parts. The calendar I've got built for the first 6 months of 2020. That'll include the Friday Flex Trains and then the every other Friday Daikin Fridays. Those will all be up on our Johnstone Solutions calendar, on our training calendar here within hopefully the next few days. Rachel was on vacation the last week of the year, so I know it's not put on the calendar yet, but all the topics will be listed for each week, what we're discussing. The first 2 months of the year is all going to be about universal parts. I'll actually be heading over to Dayton, Ohio today to spend the day with Greg Millsaps. We're wrapping up a 3-day program that's going to be available in May for anyone that's interested in joining that. It's going to be a 3-day workshop on service managers and building and developing service managers, and what those roles and responsibilities are and how you can affect the performance of a service department. And one of the things that we talk about in that class is key performance indicators. So KPIs are what we use in the business sector to track how a business is functioning. It's just numbers that we look at, that we can set goals for, and that we can make adjustments in our business to try to maintain certain profit margins based on key performance indicators. Well, even in the service realm, in HVAC, we have a lot of KPIs that we follow, that we look at to kind of judge how our business is being ran from our department, because we are a revenue generating function of the business. So we really should look at how those businesses develop, how we turn those into lead profit generating businesses and departments. Within that, there are a couple of things that we look at for KPIs that are affected by the parts that we use and the parts that we stock. So if we look at, let me grab my handy dandy Sharpie here. If we look at some basic KPIs, one of them that stands out here is, service callbacks per technician. I got another screen here in a second we're going to pop over to that's related to that. But what we try to do is we try to maintain a very low service callback rate in a service department, because that's lost revenue if we have to return. So being able to close, that first time closure rate is very important for a service department. If we get to a job and we have some of our common items that have failed, we don't want to have to go back to the shop. We don't want to have to go to the wholesaler and get those replacement parts. If we can keep some universal parts on our service van, on our service vehicle, we can reduce that service callback ratio, and we can reduce that or increase that first time closure rate. But what parts do we keep? When we talk about days of old in the HVAC industry, we used to be able to keep 7 or 8 parts on our van and work on 90% of the furnaces that were on the market. I used to do a lot of residential refrigeration. That's how I got started into the commercial industrial side. We were a residential and commercial HVAC company, very small company, and we also did residential. I mean, it was basically a family-owned mom and pop shop, and we tried to work on everything that we could for our customers. Heck, there were times where Bob and I would work on dryers if it was something common, or if it was vent piping, or whatever, switches, and we were just general tradesmen. So even in the residential refrigeration side, we kept universal parts on our van, because we were working out of Johnson County, but Johnson County, we might be 30 minutes away from the shop, and we might be an hour away from our nearest distributor. So keeping universal parts handy is pretty critical. Some of them are more expensive though, which is why a lot of people don't keep universal parts, and they're going to have a long shelf life. They may sit on that van for a season, sometimes a couple of seasons, but when we need them, that's when they really come in handy. So let me get rid of this screen and we'll move on to our next one. Oh, wrong button. Erase. Move the arrow. So that first time closure rate is what we're talking about. That is one of our KPIs that we look at. If we talk about what that first time closing rate is, if we look at technicians in the field, a high performing HVAC technician should have a 80% or greater first time closure rate. So that means 80% or higher of the times that they go out to that job, they should be able to repair that job while they're there. Now, I know sometimes we have to have universal parts or OEM parts versus our universal parts, but there are a lot of times we can use those universals. And when we used to keep all these universal parts, we were able to hit 90% because so many manufacturers were using the same controls, the same or similar ignition modules and gas valves. And those days are changing. So the focus on using first time closure rate as a KPI indicator is definitely changing, but we still want to try to keep that up as high as possible. So let's look at the different components that we have available to us that are considered universal replacements. Now, each one of these slides we're going to be diving into for every flex train for the next 2 months. So I just wanted to kind of be doing a general overview of what our topics are going to be in case anybody has any questions about these along the way. Because we always do questions at the end of each flex train and want to give you a heads up of what we'll be talking about in case you have questions on any of these. So when we get into universal gas valves, if we have a standing pilot system, which I know residential we're starting to have fewer and fewer of those, but in the commercial side, we still have a lot of standing pilot gas valves. And if you have a universal standing pilot gas valve on your van, you can have a gas valve that can control most universal valves are between 50 and all the way up to 250,000 BTU. Some of them will tap out at about 200, but a lot of them will go all the way up to 250,000 BTU capability on that 3/4 inch universal gas valve. That gives you a lot of flexibility on what kind of furnaces you can cover with a single gas valve and how many different manufacturers can be replaced with that one particular one. If we talk about electronic ignition, hot surface ignition, we also have valves that are very flexible and very universal to replace some that we have in the brand, because typically we're only going to see Honeywell and White Rogers. That's really our two primary gas valves that we're going to encounter, especially with our equipment. So a lot of those valves are built on same principles as far as manifold pressure and operating conditions. So the BTU capacity range is pretty broad on the valves that we use. So if we can keep a universal gas valve around, we're going to find that there's a lot of times we can use those valves to replace our existing gas valve. Even if it doesn't look the same, doesn't fit quite identical, we can tend to use those to complete that job on that first time. That Honeywell on the left will be one of the first ones we cover, and we'll talk about its flexibility and how we can convert that thing, because these valves, especially these universal valves, a lot of them will come with the LP conversion kits with them, so we can use this valve for natural gas or LP gas. So if you're going on a no heat call out in the middle of the boonies and you're familiar with the furnace and it's a standing pilot furnace, well, if you've got a universal gas valve with you, you may not use it, but what if you get out there? What if you get out there and you find that you got a gas valve that's not opening, or it's prematurely opening, or the pilot is not swinging from pilot position to main position? We can have a valve on hand that we can use for that particular situation. So universal gas valves will be one of our first topics. Universal control boards. I know, especially as we're getting into multi-staging and inverter and modulating gas furnaces, we don't have as much of ability to use universal boards, but we do have 2-stage universal ignition modules out there. So we can use some of these universal boards to cover all the way up into the 96% furnaces. By the time we get into the 97s, now we're talking about modulating furnaces that have a very distinct control board. But even the manufacturers are starting to swing towards the benefits of using universal replacement control boards. If we look at what happened in the Amana product lines, Amana switched from the Comfort Net platform over to the Comfort Bridge platform, which allows that furnace to be commissioned with a mobile app, with a Cool Cloud app. Well, what they're doing now is they're even building those ignition control boards that will operate a large range of equipment, and all we have to do is use the Bluetooth app to tell that new control board what furnace we have based on its model number, and we can now just simply put the firmware into that control board, and now it is exactly the control board that we need for our furnace. So I could look at an Amana furnace and take a single board and control all the single stage stuff, all the two stage stuff, whether it's 80 or it's 90, and simply give it the firmware, and that will give it all of its ramp profiles. It'll give it all of its demands for its operating characteristics, all by using one board. So even our manufacturers are looking at the benefits of using universal or more universal control boards. It's less parts that we have to keep on our vans. You know, we got out of doing residential refrigeration for one reason. Our return rate on refrigeration repair for residential moved from 60% to 100%. Because what happened in the residential refrigerator realm, I used to keep a universal timer, a universal thermostat, and a universal relay, and a 3-in-1 compressor starter, a hard start kit, and I could fix almost every residential refrigerator in the market. Didn't matter what brand it was. When we started moving to solid state control boards for the operation of our residential refrigerators, every brand and every model had its own control board. So immediately, if I had a problem, I had to go round up the part. So as a company, we decided that the residential repair just had too high of a return rate and a low closure rate, first time closure rate. So we dropped residential refrigeration and just kept the commercial and industrial side. So we don't want to be those companies that get to a point where we can only work on the brand of equipment that we install, which, you know, we are kind of moving that direction as an industry because there's so much technology out there. Technicians are having to become trained in a specific brand. But if we look at it from the standpoint of we would like to be able to service as many different brands as possible, we have to look at universal parts to be able to maintain that. So when we're talking about capacitors, if you do not keep a universal capacitor on your van, you are failing your customer. A lot of companies do not like to sell universal capacitors because of the cost of them. But even if you just think about the customer satisfaction of getting that unit up and running until we get a proper size capacitor for it. You know, if I'm out on a call and I simply have a bad capacitor because I have a dirty condenser coil, and I've cleaned that dirty condenser coil, and I don't have the correct size capacitor on my van, if I have a Turbo 200 style, it could be, there's other brands, we have Titans, you know, there's a variety of manufacturers of universal capacitors, but even if we just use that universal capacitor to get that customer up and running, we have satisfied that customer and we have opened up our window at the call center to be able to reschedule that at a convenient time. So I always kept two Turbo 200 capacitors on my van. I didn't sell them very often because a lot of times a customer would rather pay for me to come back and complete that some other time than the premium price of a Turbo 200. But some companies use a flat rate fee for your capacitors. And I've seen a flat, here locally, I have seen a flat rate capacitor charge of $120. So it doesn't matter what size capacitor is, they charge $120 flat rate for any capacitor that needs to be changed. So even if you have that Turbo 200 and you stock a variety of different size capacitors, if you have to use that more expensive capacitor for 1 out of every 20 jobs, we have a 5% increase in the use of these Turbo 200s. You know, 5% of our total revenue is based on a potential profit loss on the capacitor. Who cares? Yes, it's a number that we track, but satisfaction of that customer is a much greater KPI to focus on than just the profit margin on a capacitor. You know, I could take this one Turbo 200 capacitor and I could do, I don't think it tells me on that one. I think that one goes up to 55. They've now even got the little minis that I can do for just plain run capacitors for fan motors. So usually there's a 200 to 200X, and then there's the little mini, and we'll go into those, and we'll talk about setting them up, and we'll dive into detail on these. But just be aware that if you do not currently stock universal capacitors on your service fans, you should. Now, what about contactors and relays? In our FlexTrain class on contactors and relays, we tore apart a contactor and we tore apart relays, looking at the construction of them. And really what we have to understand is, are we replacing it with the proper application? Are we replacing a single pole contactor with a two pole contactor on accident? So we'll dive into, in our contactor and relay FlexTrain this time, of what applications a universal contactor, universal relay will cover, and how to read the wiring diagrams on them to understand if we're actually replacing these with the proper control knock. So we're talking about a heat pump contactor. We're talking about a contactor that does not typically break both legs. We are only breaking one leg on a heat pump contactor. So we'll get into that. But there's a variety of universal contactors and relays that are handy to have. I always kept a 24 volt coil contactor. I always kept 120, and I always kept a 240. And I typically kept all of those in a 3-pole because I didn't know if I was going to be working on residential or commercial, industrial. So as long as I had a 3-pole contactor, I could use that 3-pole contactor to operate any residential air conditioning system that was contactor driven. If we look at universal relays, not only do we have universal RPN style or peanut relays, we also have universal start relays for compressors. A lot of people don't know that. We have a variety of universal relays that can be used for starting compressors, and you simply have to know, what your range of horsepower is on those. Universal motors, I really didn't keep very many OEM motors on my van. The only OEM motors, at least from the residential side, the only OEM motors that I kept on my van was the Carrier Bryant 1/8, the little oddball, I think it was 1/8 horse condenser fan motor, just because I couldn't use any of the rescue motors to fit it because the motor stack heights were too thick and they wouldn't allow me to get my fan into the proper position into the venturi. And we'll go over all of that, proper placement of fan blades when using universal motors. But universal motors, like rescue motors, are a extremely valuable item to have. I kept 6 different universal rescue motors on my service fan, including the rescue watt motors, because I could keep a motor that has multiple horsepower and can be reversed to the proper rotation that I need. So I could take one motor and cover an abundance of different manufacturers of motors. But there's some things that you need to know when we're doing that to make sure that we are getting the proper motor and that we are using it in an installation that is going to allow the airflow to maintain its original specs. So we'll dive into universal motors. And we don't really think about thermostats as being universal, but they really are. If we look at what has changed in the thermostat industry in the last 10 years, I can now take a thermostat and operate about 90% of the pieces of equipment that are in our field. So we can talk about single staging, multi-staging. We can do, in some instances now, modulating furnaces and inverters, because once we get into the Amana Comfort Bridge platform, all I need is a single stage thermostat to operate those. I can operate boilers. I can operate a variety of pieces of equipment because of the multiple terminals that I use and the ability to tell this thermostat what it's actually going to be controlling. I even have additional terminals. I know the Nest and the Ecobee for sure have the additional star terminal that I can designate what I want that to be. So I can even now take this thermostat and allow it to be a thermostat plus a humidistat. So our thermostats have gotten to a point where we need to rethink the capability of thermostats based on how universal they are. And yeah, you may not sell a Nest thermostat on every call that you go to. You may be selling T6s because they're a great thermostat, or you may be selling more of an entry line thermostat to most of your customers. But it's nice to have a thermostat on your van that is multi-purpose in case you get into that situation where you need to have a more universal thermostat for your installation. What about flame detection? You know, we have pretty well shifted over as an industry from a standing pilot operation into a flame rectification circuit. But for a service guy, you still are going to run into some standing pilot situations out there. You know, we're going to run into boilers, we're going to run into furnaces, we're going to run into hot water heaters, we're going to run into equipment that still has to have a millivolt generating function to them. So we have, and particularly with Honeywell, you know, their thermocouples are pretty flexible. They're pretty universal in the different pilot assemblies that they fit into. So I only kept on my van Honeywell universal thermocouples because I could fit so many applications. I could use that one thermocouple to operate a hanging wall heater or a pizza oven, and it took the function of all those pieces of equipment into account. If we look at flame rods, you know, we'll see flame sensors all the time, and I get on my tangents constantly about a flame sensor not being a sensor, but we still call it a sensor. Anyhow, we actually have some universal style flame rods out there that are, you know, they're long rods. Typically they're 4 to 6 inch rods, and just remember, there's nothing super fancy about that rod. It's just a piece of stainless steel. You know, if we need to keep a long rod on our van and cut that thing down to length, I have absolutely no problem with that. It's just stainless steel. Cut it up, Sawzall it, take your file, polish it down, get rid of your corners, make sure it's the same length as the one that you're replacing. And I have absolutely no problem if you take a universal flame rod and cut that thing to length and put it into an application. So something to think about as far as keeping, if you're going to keep a flame rod on your van, why not keep one that has multiple purposes to it? And definitely when we get into ignition sources and universal igniters, you know, there's a couple things that we have to look at. We have to look at the design of the original igniter. We have to know if it's silicon carbide or nitride. We have to know its ignition location, because some igniters do not like high stage fire. So, you know, some manufacturers fire on low stage, some manufacturers fire on high stage on a 2-stage furnace or a modulating furnace. And some igniters are not constructed for the abrupt ignition of a high stage light. So it's good to know the differences in universal igniters to know what ones work, because they don't fit all applications. And we'll dive into igniters and talk about their universal functions. Okay, guys, well, if that's all, I think we'll go ahead and call it a fairly short day today. Appreciate you all joining FlexTrain, and that email invite that I sent out to everybody, you're welcome to send that to anyone so that they can register, and the registration instructions will also be on our Johnstone Solutions training webpage, and I'll make sure to show you that in case anybody doesn't know where that is. So if you go to Johnstone Supplier, you go to the Johnstone Solutions website, whichever one you use, and you go to the training calendar. This is where all of our topics will be listed and all of our classes. And this will be all locations in Cincinnati, Dayton, and Indianapolis. Oh, and I will be meeting Monday with the architect for Indy West, so look forward to getting launched on that. Well, that being said, everybody, thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone had a happy new year, and we will see you next week on FlexTrain. Be safe.
See you later, Cliff.
Thank you.
See you guys.